Good evening, everyone. I hope that you can all hear me just fine. And welcome to our presentation tonight. Is that our presentation tonight about understanding the crisis in the Ukraine, which has now become a war. So we had to cross off crisis and add war. So that's where we're at. I would like to say that it was because that we were so insightful. We knew how things would all play out, but that would not be true. I teach Monday evening, Dr. Street teaches Tuesday evening, and Dr. Pavlakis teaches Wednesday evening. So we had to have this panel presentation on a Thursday evening. So that's how that happened. I would like to introduce the panelists. My name is Jeremy Johnson. I'm the Department Chair of Political Science, and I am a graduate at the University of Pennsylvania with a master's and doctorate from Brown and additional degrees from Villanova University. Dr. Dean Pavlakis is a professor in the Department of History. He's a graduate of Harvard University. He has a master's from the Yale School of Management, master's and doctorate from the State University of New York at Buffalo. He teaches modern history, modern British history, and Atlantic history, and many other things. Alex Street is a professor in the political science department. He is a graduate of Oxford University with a master's degree from the University of California, Berkeley, and a PhD at the University of California at Berkeley. He is a specialist in comparative politics at Carroll. And we're fortunate today to also have an undergraduate student who will share some insights with us. Her name is Elena Wagner. She's a senior at Carroll College. She's a major in international relations and political science with minors in French and constitutional studies. And she recently studied in Estonia in 2021 and will share a little bit of her insights with us. So we're going to get started with Dr. Pavlakis. So please go ahead, Dean.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Johnson. The music that you heard before this presentation was a Ukrainian folk song, a song of mourning, and seemed to be appropriate given everything that's happened today. My job as a historian is to give you historical context and background, and I'm going to do it through a series of maps that will take you in just a short period of time through 1,000 years of shared Ukrainian and Russian history. So first of all, as you probably know, we're facing an invasion of Ukraine today. That invasion has been composed of a push towards the capital city of Kyiv, an invasion of the city of Kharkiv, and the taking of a small island to the southwest. There's also been an attempted invasion from Luhansk and Donetsk, but as of 11 a.m. Montana time, that had not been successful. There is also an invasion from Crimea heading on to Ukraine. So this is an invasion of multiple dimensions. Why? Where does it come from? Well, we're going to start with the Russian and Ukrainian origin story. Every people have an origin story with varying degrees of fidelity to historical reality, but for both these peoples, it starts with a place called Kievan Rus. But first of all, I want to make sure you all understand where Ukraine is, right, in respect of a giant Russia. But Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe outside of Russia, which is first. And not a trivial place, 44 million people. Turning to this origin story, it starts with a people called the Kievan Rus, who dominated all the East Slavic people who would eventually become the Russians, or Great Russians as they call themselves, the Belarusians, and the Ukrainians. Occupying this territory were a group of principalities all related. They did not push south into what is now southern Ukraine, except to trade via the river valleys, because this was inhospitable steppe country, suitable for horses, which means that nomadic peoples often passed through there, and not very suitable for agriculture before the age of modern farming implements. This Kievan Rus set of states was smashed by the Mongols in the 1200s. And it is in the aftermath of that smashing that we get the split between Russians and Ukrainians. As the Mongols are gradually pushed out, You get the state of Muscovy, which is the parent state of modern Russia, and the Kingdom of Poland. And as you can see, the Kingdom of Poland rather quickly takes over this territory that is now Western Ukraine. Here there is a peasantry under Polish overlordship for 300 to 400 years. And it is in this period under Polish rule that the Ukrainian people develop their distinctive language, which Russians would call a dialect, while the Russians developed in their own direction. So the two peoples began to divide culturally. But we all know who wins in this competition, and it is the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire gradually takes over all this area in the 1700s. They call what we're calling Ukraine Little Russia, as opposed to Great Russia, which is them. And they call this territory, this sparsely inhabited territory, Little Russia. So here, New Russia. So here is Little Russia and New Russia. They needed to populate this new territory. So colonists came, and that's what it is, it's colonization, from both Ukraine and Russia. So Ukrainian speakers come into this area, Russian speakers move into this area. Into this peninsula known as the Crimea, that is exclusively Russian speakers. Ukrainians don't go there. But they go to many places through here and mix with the Russian people. They switch languages. You end up with Russian-speaking people who identify as Ukrainian. You get Russian-speaking people who merge into the Ukrainian population, making the linguistic map complicated. So here it is. We keep hearing about Western Ukraine. Western Ukraine is the land where Ukrainian is predominantly spoken. In the old territories of New Russia, it's a mix. As Russia industrialized, the cities of Donetsk and Luhansk became almost completely Russian-speaking as more colonists came in. But the rest of the territory is mixed Russian-speaking Russians, Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians. So you may ask, how did these people, Vladimir Putin has said this country has never had an independent existence. But that's not factually true. During the First World War in 1917, Ukrainian nationalists declared the independence of Ukraine. They claimed all the colored territory. This line is the modern territory of Ukraine. They claimed this whole area and held on to it more or less for 3 years until the Bolsheviks overcame this Ukrainian state and tried to absorb it into the USSR. Now, you've heard Putin complain about Lenin. Well, it was Lenin who said, we are not imperialists. We Bolsheviks are against imperialism. So the Ukrainians can keep their distinctive language and culture through this period, encouraged by the USSR. Lenin also made the decision, which Putin is treating as controversial, to take the industrial areas of the Donbass, including Donetsk and Luhansk, which are primarily ethnic Russian, and put them in the Ukraine. This was made even more complicated by a later Soviet ruler who tagged in the Crimea into Ukraine, even though it was completely ethnically Russian and Crimean Tatar and not Ukrainian. After this point, we turn to a rather morbid 20th century. Ukrainians are very aware of Stalin's famine. They call it the Holodomor. It was undertaken during the efforts to collectivize Soviet agriculture. Stalin came to the conclusion that the Ukrainians were resisting collectivization and retaliated in 1935-36 with a massive confiscation of peasant goods, leading to widespread starvation, estimated in this Chicago American paper at 6 million people. In fact, nobody knows how many died. Some Ukrainian historians give much higher numbers, 12, even 20 million. Other sources say maybe it was as little as 5 million. at any event, it was a massive death caused by government policy. So you probably wouldn't be too surprised that 8 years later, when the Nazis invaded, Ukrainians welcomed them, initially pleased to be liberated from the rule of a country that had starved millions of their people. And they tried to collaborate with the Nazis. This did not last very long. The Nazi plan for Ukraine was for a third of the people in the country to perish by starvation through this process, and for the survivors to become the obedient peasants to German overlords. As a result, Ukrainians turned away to the extent they could from the Nazis, and in fact, over 4 million Ukrainians joined the Red Army to fight Germany. But when you hear Putin make these sort of inexplicable reference to fascists, this is one of the origins of that story. Afterwards, of course, we get the Cold War. The countries colored or shaded lightly are the Soviet satellite states, and then the Soviet Union itself with its constituent subordinate republics through that period of time. NATO was formed during that time to counter what was perceived as a Soviet threat to Western Europe. Putin is assembled after the fall of the Soviet Union, when Ukraine became independent. All the constituent republics became independent. Putin has two specific grievances that are brought up over and over again. There are others, but there are two. The first of which is the two revolutions in Ukraine that brought reforming, more Western-leaning leaders to power, the Orange Revolution in 2004 and the Maidan Revolution in 2014. He feels that if anybody's going to monkey with Ukraine's government, it should be Russia and not what he perceives as the West manipulating the Ukrainian political system. His second grievance is the expansion of NATO. And you can see on this slide, all the countries that have joined NATO since 1997, some of them former Soviet satellite states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, former Soviet republics. And he is frantic to the point of hysteria in his statements that Ukraine should never become part of this mutual defense bloc. As you can see, and you've heard about incremental troops being added to these places, NATO and the US, either as part of NATO or independently, have troops in all these countries, but no troops, you'll notice, in Ukraine. And the point is, these troops are intended to be a trigger. As the 1,000 troops in Estonia would never be able to fight off the Russian army, but the notion in NATO is that if one member is attacked, they're all attacked, and it would bring the full might of NATO to bear against Russia, even if Estonia was lost in the process. And with that, seeing as we have a student on the line who is present in Estonia, is Elena with us?
Yes.
Elena, we'll turn it over to you, I guess.
Alrighty, thank you so very much, Dr. Pavlakis. Yes, as Dr. Pavlakis mentioned, I did have the opportunity to study in Russia this previous year from early February to July, during which I was also able to make a trip into Russia. I would just like to briefly provide a few observations relating to current sentiments towards Russia in a post-Soviet nation via my experiences associated with this and how they might perhaps relate to the current situation. One, of course, is, as with many close Soviet nations, there are border communities within Estonia. Nearly 25% of Estonia is ethnically Russian, concentrated, unsurprisingly, or near the border. When I was in these areas ordering in a restaurant or shopping in a store, it was much easier to use Russian than Estonian, and many of the things that you would come across were more culturally Russian than Estonian. So it does display this sort of cultural homogeny that you will find in these perhaps border communities often. Another is Estonian identity as it relates to Russia, which may perhaps also relate to other post-Soviet nations, in which for the Estonians I spoke to, particularly those around the ages of 30 to 40, they wanted to get as far away from this sort of Slavic identity as possible. for them, the Slavic identity sort of associates with the Soviet era, where the domination that pervaded the history of the country really is connected with economic depression and suppression of information. A fun fact, they'd actually really prefer to be more associated with Nordic identity, which is seen as more forward thinking. But in a more interesting note, older people are more polarized when it comes to Russia on both sides of the spectrum. But given the time of their independence, those who were teenagers or younger or around the time of the independence in 1991 have a more greater trust with and comfort with the West. But this also relates to one of the most interesting experiences I had in going from Russia to Estonia, that being crossing the border. Initially, when I had crossed the border into the Russian border point, the person who I met with was friendly as I spoke Russian with them, and she remarked to me kindly about how far I was from home and how well my Russian was, even though I'd only taken a semester. At this point, people were moving through the checkpoint relatively easily, as is to be expected with the cross-border community that is had around that part of Estonia. However, when I arrived at the gate, things became to a little bit of a halt, taking a bit of time to check my info, check it against something else, having the person I was traveling with, a French friend, also come up, display his info. And then a while later, someone came from outside and asked me if I spoke Russian, to which I responded yes, and then asked me if I would be willing to come for questioning. My French friend, being rather shocked, asked the reason for this, and without hesitation, the person who had come for questioning simply pointed to my nationality as American on my identification documents. So this experience for me really pointed out two key things. One, the initial greeting versus the official handling of my arrival shows to me an important difference and distinction between the Russian people and the Russian government, as this is one of the things that really divides in between the two, is that for the Russian people, there is a sort of friendliness that the Russian government perhaps isn't able to supply, and that perhaps one can consider in thinking about this. But for the second, for the way that the government side is, the fact that I was taken and my French friend was not, perhaps shows concern that this is less about the West overtaking and concern for the West, but rather the influence that the US has as implied with the influence of the West, given the power that the country possesses. I don't mean to overemphasize the role of the US, but as Dr. Pavlakis mentioned, one interesting thing, the only other American I met while in Estonia was someone who came from a military base in Germany to run a special joint exercise for the annual spring storm exercise that Estonia hosts with NATO near the border of Russia. And this is a really major point of difference between Ukraine and Estonia, is involvement with NATO, which appears to act as a deterrent, but also perhaps as a thorn in the side and an example of what could happen with other satellite states. And so the prevalence of NATO operations to assure allies in the region that such tensions have been simmering for perhaps an unfortunate while. And perhaps on that note, I will be turning things over to Dr. Johnson. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elena. Alex.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I'm going to pull up a screen here as well. Holy moly, too many screens. Yeah. So that's showing the presentation view, I think. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to present, I think, a somewhat different perspective from Dr. Pavlakis. And I think I may try and emphasize the points of difference in order to stimulate conversation among us and perhaps stimulate the audience as well a little. And maybe say some things that will surprise you a little. I think the perspective that I have, though, is I think it is fairly typical of somebody whose training is in part in this field that we call comparative politics. The terminology is kind of not particularly helpful. But the general idea is to look at the politics within countries and to think that a lot of what they do depends on the politics within the countries. In some ways similar to what Elena was just saying about, there are differences between the Russian government and the Russian people. And I think that's probably true in the US, and I think it's a lot more true in Russia. So there's a sense in which when I hear people talk about this and they talk about Russia, sometimes I think, I don't know that I believe that there is such a thing as Russia in the way that people talk about it. When people talk about, oh, Russia wants this, or Russian interests are that seems to me like often an unhelpful way of lumping together a bunch of people who disagree. I think we would probably recognize that about ourselves. If you say America wants this, some of us might think, well, wait a minute, I feel like Americans are pretty good at arguing about that. In Russia, in some ways, it's even worse because really, to a much greater extent than here, Russia is just dominated by one person and by the clique of people around him. So in this sense, I don't really believe in Russia. And I don't think this is really about Russia. I think it is about this person called Vladimir Putin, and not only about him, but about the system of rule that he has. Because no single person can do everything on their own. But what has happened is, because of the particular history, I think I would emphasize perhaps more recent history than Dr. Pavlakis, and I would put it this way. You have the Soviet Union. They're trying to do communism. That means something like common ownership of the means of production, so common ownership of the factories, the banks, all of these things we used to make stuff. In practice, it didn't work well at all as an economic system, in part because it became horrendously corrupt. When they said common ownership, they meant in the end government ownership, and then government officials became very corrupt. So you get a corrupt system that doesn't work well and eventually collapses. It was an economic collapse. And when they collapsed, in the 1990s, they tried to do a version of capitalism. But it turned out to be probably the most corrupt version of capitalism in the world. Because you had a sudden transition from a system where, in theory, everything had been owned, not by individuals, but by the government, to a very rapid privatization, where all of these huge natural resources ended up in the private hands of just a few people. And they were people who we now describe as the oligarchs. And so it's basically a bunch of very rich people and some military people. So it's, a few hundred people, maybe. Some of whom work quite closely with Putin. He needs to be a bit careful with them, because if he's screwing things up for them, then they might try and organize to get rid of him. On the other hand, he is more powerful than any single one of them. And so there's this kind of weird dynamic within that group, I think. And this context has been very corrupt. They distributed all these natural resources. And now, since they split up the natural resources, they even use the state to set up new forms of corruption. So, for example, after Russia occupied Crimea a few years ago, they built a new bridge from the Russian mainland to Crimea. And guess whose company got to build the bridge? It was a construction company owned by somebody who was a judo buddy of Vladimir Putin in the 1980s and 1990s. That is not because the judo buddy is really good at building bridges, right? That's just corruption. And that's how the Russian economy works. And the thing is, it's not just me. I have been to Russia. I was only there very briefly before they deported me. I can talk about that later if you like. This is something that I read that everyone in Russia knows, basically. They know it much worse than I do because they have to deal with this. So then, in this context, what Putin is worried about is democracy. Maybe he cares about NATO, but I think mostly he cares about Russian people democratizing. Because if they democratize, he's going to be held accountable for these thefts and the murders and the crimes that he's committed in order to get this much power. So what happened in Ukraine is that it was starting to get closer to the European Union, which is a much richer area. Russia has a bad economy. The total size of the Russian economy is somewhere between the size of the Spanish economy and the Italian economy. So it's a big country, has 140 million people, but the economy is a mess because you can't really have a proper economy if you have to worry the whole time that a corrupt Russian judo guy from the 1980s is going to turn up when you're trying to run your business. So what happens is that Ukraine is basically doing better than Russia. The Russian people can see. There was a big protest that Dean Pavlakis mentioned briefly in 2014. There was a vote in Ukraine about whether they would start a process of becoming part of the European Union. So basically a club of richer countries to their west. And the president at the time was an ally of Putin's, and it looked very much like he'd been bribed to suddenly switch the decision and say, we're not going to do that. And so there was a round of protests. He sent in the police. A bunch of people got killed in the protests, and then the protests got way bigger because people were so annoyed about the people getting killed. And he ran away and he fled to Russia. And since then, Ukraine has been more democratic and more firmly on this path towards wanting to be part of this rich country club. And this is just a disaster for Putin, because right next to Russia, it's a reminder of how good life could be for Russian people if they could only have a less corrupt system than Putin's system. And in the meantime, there are people who are organizing. That picture I had a couple of minutes ago about Vladimir Putin's palace, this is a picture taken by drone by this Russian democracy activist called Alexei Navalny. So I think, in my opinion, Putin is worried about democracy in Russia. That is why he will mess with places like Ukraine, because Ukraine can't really become this rich, prosperous example that would be dangerous to him. If he can destabilize it enough and occupy part of its territory, then it's hard for it to join the European Union. It's hard for it to join NATO. So this is my kind of perspective. In this context, what can we do? Again, in the same way that I don't believe in Russia, I really don't believe in we. Like, different people are going to want all sorts of different things. The US and some European countries are starting to talk about sanctions. It's tricky because I don't think Putin really cares. He's a very rich and very powerful person within his country. So you can sanction him, and I'm not sure it's really going to work. You could try and sanction some of these rich buddies of his, and they might get a bit annoyed. And if that would work well enough, again, they might try and replace him. But that's going to be very hard for them to do, because again, he's the kind of the one on top, and he's, you know, keeping his enemies close and all that kind of thing. Or you could try and influence the Russian people, but the Russian people, they already know how bad Putin is, and making the Russian economy worse, I'm not sure that that's actually going to have a real direct influence on their willingness to have a protest and an uprising against Putin. That is mostly driven by what's going on within his system. There is some sign that there's a lot of offshore wealth held by these Russian oligarchs. Maybe you could try and target that as a way of trying to get them to get rid of him. Maybe you try and persuade them that you think he's too unstable and they'd be better off with a more stable thief person in charge. I do think it's possible this will backfire on Putin. I don't think he's a genius. This whole analysis, and I'm going to talk about the limitations of this in a minute, but this whole analysis hinges on this idea that he's acting in a somewhat rational way to try and consolidate and improve his own power. But that doesn't mean he's infallible. Wars are unpopular. There are already some signs within Russia of protests over this. Once Russian soldiers start coming home in body bags, it's going to be more unpopular, potentially. Wars can begin to give you a momentary boost in popularity, but they may not be, in the long run, good for him. What we do know is that nobody knows how unpopular Putin is. Even Putin doesn't know how unpopular he is, because nobody will tell the truth, because it's dangerous to tell the truth about what you think of a ruler like this. So probably he's going to look popular all the way until he suddenly looks very unpopular, because everyone finally turns on him. And when that final switch happens, we don't know. We know that's how it worked when the USSR collapsed, though, for example. And that tends to be how these kind of corrupt regimes collapse, is there's all these signs of pressure, and they're not breaking, and they're not breaking, and then suddenly they break. The one other thing about Putin is that he's advancing in his years. He's 69 years old. As he gets older, this system will also become less stable, because he'll start to lose some of his abilities, and there'll be more and more jockeying among his rivals to replace him. He's maybe getting to the point where he's old enough that some of these kind of rationality approach that I've been talking about is questionable, right? At this point, he's like, well, how many years left do I have anyway? What the heck? I've already had my rich, fancy life. Maybe I'm going to get myself some crazy historical legacy. The way that that social scientists, that political scientists try and think about this is, believe it or not, tough as these situations are, we are trying to do what we think of as science. So try and have a fairly simple model that explains what we think is going on. In this case, one way to try and do that is to think about, well, what would this person's interests be? Having said all of this, I think there are some insights from this approach, but the invasion of Ukraine actually is bigger than I would have thought on this basis. I would have thought the more rational thing for Putin to do would be to destabilize it. A full invasion like this seems much more dangerous to him. So I want to acknowledge, I think it's reasonable to acknowledge that I'm not sure this can explain everything. And that's one of the frustrations of studying political science, is that at some point you are dealing with individuals, and individuals can do idiosyncratic things. So that's my perspective. The perspective is not particularly optimistic. It doesn't have much of anything to do with us as Americans. It really is about Russia and Ukraine. And it's about a very corrupt set of people who may well be able to hold on to power and keep on making life much worse for innocent bystanders and people who are just trying to raise their kids. It's horrible.
Thank you, Alex. I'm going to give remarks about three sort of very different subjects, but not go into great detail about any of the three, batting cleanup here. So I'll talk a little bit about US foreign policy and economics, religion, which I think is very important, understanding religion in Russia and Ukraine, some of what's going on there, and then something about domestic American politics. So ever since the end of for many decades, we've had discussions about liberal democracy and the importance of liberal democracy in the world. And certainly at the end of the Cold War, there was a great deal of discussion. In the context of Russia and the post-Soviet republics, so much of that got sort of morphed into what we call neoliberalism, an economic agenda, which involved a market, markets, marketization, and privatization, but without supporting a safety net for individuals, which has made people much more desperate and hurt living standards throughout the post-Soviet era, and drops in life expectancy, and has caused a lot of burdens. So that's been one issue. A significant issue is the economic problems that have gone on for decades since then. Another element was, of course, what sort of a state you established after the collapse of the USSR. You could have gone with a more parliamentarian system or a strong presidential system. There were debates about that. And we have a strong presidential system, essentially, in Russia, which probably has not been very beneficial. Probably have been much better to try to adopt a parliamentarian system. So even though there's been a lot of rhetoric, American rhetoric about liberal democracy, often the practice it becomes an economic agenda supported by a number of academics in the United States, et cetera, early on in the 20th century. So some of this, there's been a lot of problems. Is sort of just the prevailing assumptions earlier about, while we say we'd like liberal democracy, often the emphasis becomes an economic agenda, which becomes concerning when things don't work out as planned. And the transition was terrible from the Soviet Union into the post-Soviet world. So that's one issue. Certainly, this has helped promote Russian nationalism, and that's why I want to bring in a little bit about religion and the connections with religion and Russian nationalism. Now, religion in Ukraine and Russia is a very complicated subject, just like it is in the United States. So we'll just do a very quick overview here to try to relate this back to the conflict today. So the Russian Orthodox Church, who's headed by the Patriarch of Moscow, has reclaimed much of his former political influence, and he's part of spearheading an agenda of a traditionalist Orthodox cause, and has worked to support as a symbol to religious conservatives around the world. The Russian Orthodox Church is very much connected with Russian nationalistic ambitions. So Russia itself, this goes back to some of the history that Dr. Pavlakis mentioned. It converted to Christianity late in the 10th century. The date's often given as 988, when Prince Vladimir married the sister of the Byzantine Emperor Basil II. However, from that though, there's a whole bunch of different traditions which lay claim to that. And you can do that. There's a lot of complexity with the evolution of religion. Taking that tour through very quick through Christian history, there were 5 ancient patriarchates: Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, with Rome and Constantinople becoming especially important when the other patriarchates were conquered in the 7th century by Islamic armies. The relationships became strained between Rome and Constantinople. Eventually, you had the Roman Catholic Church evolve in the West, and the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East. The famous date of the schism, 1054. That's one potential date in a long series of events. Now, the Patriarch of Moscow is officially ranked 5th in precedence in the Eastern Orthodox Church, after the four Greek Orthodox patriarchs, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, which does not sit well in Moscow. And there's been a lot of recent tension because for leadership within the Eastern Orthodox Church, and Ukraine has been central to this conflict. In late 2018, the Patriarch of Constantinople granted independence to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And that was a historic split from Russia. So the fallout has been significant. You have two major Orthodox churches operating in Ukraine: the Independent Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which is recognized by some of those ancient patriarchates like Constantinople and Alexandria, and then you have the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under the jurisdiction of the Moscow Patriarchate. So this stuff may seem abstruse, but it's really it's become a central flashpoint. And just on December 29, 2021, the Holy Synod of the Moscow Patriarchate, the leading body of the Russian Orthodox Church, announced its decision to announce a patriarchal exarchate in Africa, which is essentially a colonial outpost, which is and so that was under the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Alexandria, and Moscow has now, is pushing itself to run there. How does this connect with domestic politics? Well, you have a conflict that's both religious and political. That's even moving into Africa, and the political implications are potentially stark. Russia wants to have both its a political and a religious sort of expansion. And so, some of this is really connected back with the religion. Some of this, Putin gave a big speech recently about, his rationale for doing this. Some of this is informed by the whole idea about Moscow being the third Rome, with the Rome of the Roman Empire. Constantinople was Byzantium, and a continuation with Moscow being the third Rome. It's not really historically accurate. It's not some direct continuation of the Roman Empire, but you have these grand ambitions. Obviously, Putin is upset that he's not been able to have a lot of influence in Ukraine. In recent years, it's not worked well. And within the last 20 years, you might remember about the poisoning of a famous Ukrainian politician running for election that was, caused by Russia. And I do think, his inability to have sort of the influence that may be, that certainly has been very, that's been very an unhappy moment for Putin. So one other just small element about religion. There's also Catholics. There's the Catholic Church in Ukraine, and the largest one is, we think about the Roman Catholic Church, but the Catholicism is very diversified. There's, the Ukraine Catholic Church, the larger group follows the Byzantine Rite. And the question is just what will be the role, if Russia, conquers or satellite states, what will happen to Catholics in this? And it's something to be concerned about potential of religious oppression. We'll have to see how all this goes. So there's a lot of, there's a religious dimension to this. It's often not talked about, but I wanted to just get that out there also, just to sort of mention this to individuals as well. Now, my last comments were on the partisan politics in the United States. Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan, Republican of Michigan, in the mid-20th century, he said that politics stops at water's edge. Well, that was never really ever true. It's even less true today. And there's just going to be a lot of partisan sort of sniping back and forth about these issues. That's the world we live in with social media, with cable news 24 hours on all sides. It's not conducive, to sort of restrained rhetoric. And obviously, political parties to survive have to be partisan. Otherwise, like the Whig Party collapsed. On the other hand, what we've seen is that we've had hyper-partisanship in recent years. So the one thing that Republicans agree on is that they're not going to compliment Biden's job on this. However, the problem that Biden is having, that the Republicans are having, is that they don't agree with each other either about exactly what should be done. So you often see that a Republican critique is that Biden is weak, which is sort of one of the easier things to say, but it's not too precise or too specific. But we've seen that with President Trump, that he, of course, was very favorable towards Putin at times. That is well known. And certainly, there's some very influential members of the media on cable news who generally are favorable to Putin. We've seen polling, and again, this is very partisan. This is from January, polling on YouGov, that that Republican voters view leading Democrats in the country more unfavorably than Putin, Biden, Pelosi, and then Democratic voters essentially Putin polls about as well as Trump does. So you can see this sort of a split there, and just how partisan people will see things, such as a crisis. It's unknown how all this will go. But some Republicans, the more traditionalist Republicans, probably Mitch McConnell and usually Lindsey Graham are on this, would recommend a more muscular response with sanctions. And in many ways, many Republicans and Democrats have agreed on sanctions. But I expect a lot of fluidity in partisan politics. And I think Congress is going to will often let the president take the lead, because it's much easier to criticize and not really put yourself out there making a statement when the situation is just so unknown and fluid. So that's sort of where I think we're going with partisan politics in the United States. Dr. Pavlakis asked for a minute to respond to Dr. Streets, and then we're going to have questions from the audience. So go ahead, Dr. Pavlakis.
Okay, I'd just like to take a moment to answer Dr. Street's argument about all politics being local. And far be it from me to defend or whitewash Vladimir Putin's regime. Everything Dr. Street said about it is correct. But there is and has been a tradition of Russian statecraft, certainly for the last 120 years, that is frantically concerned about security. And the origins of that concern lie in invasions that many of us have forgotten. It's easy to forget that Americans occupied Russian soil in 1917, 1918. The Germans took a huge swath of Russia in World War I. The Japanese occupied the Far East. The British and the French took territory and intervened in Russia's civil war. That led to paranoia, and Joseph Stalin was a paranoid individual, but sometimes just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. The hostility between the West and the East led the Soviet Union to fear that NATO was going to become an offensive alliance against it. And then, of course, you have the memory of World War II, where the Germans invaded and cost the lives of over 25 million Soviet citizens. So there are security concerns that are part of the Russian state apparatus. And I think we can make an argument that Putin's anxieties about Ukraine and anxieties about NATO reflect that concern. That doesn't disprove anything Dr. Street said, but it might complicate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pavlakis. So let's now turn to some of our audience questions and answer them. Feel free to add the questions. Is it true that Ukraine has also been attacked for, Transnistria? I'm sorry if I messed up any pronunciations. I would love to hear more about the situation and its parallels with the separatist movements that we've talked about. Does anybody want to answer that question?
I'm willing to take it.
Go ahead.
So first of all, I need to share my screen so that 99% of the people here can understand where Transnistria is. Is this showing up?
Yes.
Okay. Transnistria is a tiny slice of the independent state of Moldova that rebelled and was taken under Putin's protection, even though, yes, it doesn't touch Russia. Back, 15, 20 years ago. It is desperately poor. Russia did move military force there in this preparation, but I have not seen anything yet about an attack from Transnistria. That could well have happened in the last 6 or 7 hours. It's very tough to keep up with these things. Is it parallel? In a way, yes, particularly in its existence as a Soviet client state that is an irritant to the main ethnic state, in this case, Moldova. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Street, share your deportation story, please.
Oh, yeah, okay, maybe in a second.
Okay, go ahead.
I guess, I don't know. I think part of my perspective on this is that I hear these words like security and identity, and I find them very ambiguous. I mean, security sounds to me, if you think about what that word would mean, it means like people not attacking me. But that's not what's going on here. Putin's attacking other people. He doesn't have any real security concerns. It's not like Ukraine was about to occupy Russia. So I feel like we sometimes, and this is, I think, a lot of what we get from the media. The media have this very narrative style. That's not necessarily a criticism, but I think that's part of why people watch cable news in the evening or whatever, because it's kind of like storytelling. Like Russia does this, America does that, security. The Russia wants this. I just think of that as I don't think that storytelling is very helpful about what's going on. Like the Moldova example. What was going on there is it's another example of Putin has occupied a tiny bit of that country and it messes that country up and it means it can't be part of the EU. And so it can't become a richer example right next door that Russians can look to and think, shoot, I wish we had more of that. That seems to me to be a much clearer, and maybe I'm wrong, but that seems to be a much clearer set of ideas about how that could happen. On the deportation, I tried to visit Russia about 20 years ago when a friend of mine was there. And yet at the time you had to get a visa. I think that may still be true. I had to get a visa in advance and I had to get an invitation. And so he just had to go to some hotel and they paid them and they were going to give me an invitation. And he gave it to me for early July. And we booked our flights for early June and we just messed up the month. The 6 and the 7 thing, I think we got them in the wrong way around. I think it may have been partly because different countries, something like that. And nobody noticed. So we had this date on our visa, but the date on the airplane tickets was different. Nobody noticed until we got to the final border guard in Moscow airport. And then they stopped me and they said, this isn't right. I think I tried to hint that I was going to bribe them because that was what was going on in Russia in the late 1990s. That was part of why Putin was originally able to claim control, is because things had just gotten so chaotic and criminal in Russia in the 1990s, with everyone just stealing whatever state assets they could. And with, as Dr. Johnson said, in part on the basis of advice from American economists who just said, oh, privatize it, don't worry. Privatizing things when like you're surrounded by a bunch of thugs is not a great idea because the thugs are just going to steal them all and then say, guess what, we privatized. So the whole thing was a mess. Anyway, they got the wrong date on the thing. The border agent, I tried to hint that I was going to bribe them, it didn't work. So they wrote Stria deportee in big letters on my passport. And I had to spend the night in Moscow airport, and then they put me on the first plane out the next morning.
Okay, there you go. Elena, you didn't quite have that experience, so that's good. So, okay, so we had a couple questions about timing, about different sort of timing. So one is, can you speak to the peculiar timing of the invasion of Crimea, followed soon after Ukraine announced it was going to become less dependent on Russian gas? And then someone else asked, why did Putin decide to strike now? What changed within the last year or two, as opposed to post-2014, to make this seem the right time to launch this campaign? So anybody on timing?
I'll take the second one.
Go ahead.
I think Dr. Street and I would both agree that the timing now has everything to do with Ukraine becoming more democratic and more successful and more leaning towards the West, and Putin can't have that on his border because it threatens his model of corrupt government.
And I agree with that too.
The one thing I would add is that, I mean, Putin's own popularity is up and down over time, but he is facing a really talented opposition leader who he has tried to kill and is now jailed, and he may yet kill in jail, called Alexei Navalny, he's done a great job of these kind of internet drone video things, and it spreads in Russia, and it's a example and a reminder of why people don't like Putin. He even did a thing where he did a kind of a hoax call of the people who tried to poison him, and he pretended that he was their boss from the Russian the secret, poisoning people government part. And he asked them all, he talked to them and he was like, okay, and he knew the names of the people who'd been involved. Somehow he'd gotten that with some investigative journalists. And so he went through the names and he's like, okay, you got to give me score out of 10. How did this guy do? How did that guy do? How did that guy do? And it's kind of hilarious. I mean, as I understand it, I don't speak Russian, but it's kind of hilarious. And then he then he posted that on YouTube as well. And so this guy is kind of talented. He's Putin worries. Putin is paranoid. I think he's paranoid about getting killed or landing in jail rather than about security. And then the coronavirus pandemic has also gone pretty badly in Russia. They tried to have their own vaccine and it doesn't work very well against these new variants. So Putin is kind of having popularity problems, and that's relevant for him.
Speaking of timing and Alex Navalny, you may not have heard that in the run-up to this invasion, they pulled Alex Navalny out of jail, tried him again, and added 15 years to his sentence. So he's covering his bases.
Any comments on Crimea, on the part of the invasion of Crimea from the panelists?
2014 is complicated. A lot was going on, including this Maidan revolution. So it's undoubtedly all related, but in what factors? We historians say, let's wait 30 years until all the documents come out.
Okay. Someone says they're pretty sure Russian citizens are already protesting. Any comments on that?
I mean, I guess I would say I've seen a little of it, and I guess this responds in some ways to what Dean just said. The bravery of these people is just amazing. Alexei Navalny was poisoned. The German government managed to get him out to Germany for medical treatment. He could have stayed there, but he went back, and they've stuck him in jail now forever, basically. And this is a guy who has a young family. It's astounding to me how brave these people are, and the people protesting in Russia today are just taking huge risks. And so I admire their bravery, and I admire the bravery of a lot of people in Ukraine as well.
We received an email earlier. I think this is a good time for this question. The news is full of what Russia is doing, but what is Ukraine doing at this time? Are people fleeing the country? Well, I've certainly read articles about thousands fleeing towards Central Europe. I don't know the total numbers, but I certainly know that. Other comments to answer this?
What I've heard is that people are fleeing from Eastern Ukraine to Western Ukraine, often sending their children or spouses or parents out of the way. And the Ukrainian government declared a state of emergency, and Zelensky has forbidden any male aged 18 or 60 from fleeing the country, from leaving the country, and everybody is going to be subject to military service.
I guess I'll add, this does seem to me like an example of why I think what Putin is doing is risky. I mean, they may win initially, but if they're in a situation where they're trying to occupy a country full of people who hate them, in the long run, that I'm not sure that's going to be so good for Putin's popularity.
There's a letter about 150 Russian oligarchs condemning Putin. One of our attendees would like to hear our perspectives on that, about Russian oligarchs who are condemning Putin. Anybody want to take that one?
I guess I hadn't seen that. My guess is if that kind of actual thing is happening, then it would not be happening in public. Like if the people who are part of his wider system at some point decide, hey, this guy's a bit nuts, why don't we have someone a bit more stable to do this version of corruption? Then they're not going to do that in public, because if they do and it's serious, then he will put them in jail too.
And any ideas about what Russian soldiers think? Are they unwilling? One problem is, of course, people in Russia are not getting full information. It's very hard in Russia to know. I mean, there's a lot of control over what you hear, so there's just a lot of, it's hard to know how people are processing information when there's just a lot you wouldn't even know if you're living in the country. Some things, but what's happening day to day, that's, it's hard to find out, I'm sure, on some of these details at least. Question, how likely is this to turn into a military conflict involving more actors than Ukrainian and Russian forces? That's a good question. Go ahead, Alex.
That's a very hard question. I don't know. Sometimes I think it's appropriate to say that we don't know.
The only thing I'll mention is that if it happens, it will happen on purpose. It will. The West has done everything, and it appears that Putin is approaching it in such a way to make the likelihood of that accidental escalation less. Right, the West is not sending a single soldier into Ukraine, so that there's no tripwire that would cause some kind of spontaneous back and forth. And Putin's invasion is very much in the East. So he seems so far to be keeping clear of the West, even though he's got troops stationed over the border in the West.
What is the deal with Putin's meeting with the Pakistani prime minister? Is that just a tactic in which he is just trying to show the public he can deal with more than just this war? Then is there really any likelihood of the US entering this unless NATO does something? After pulling out of Afghanistan, has Biden not shown that he does not want us in wars that don't have a clear outcome?
I'm afraid I don't know anything about a meeting with the Prime Minister of Pakistan. I mean, Dr. Johnson might talk about this as well, but I mean, it does seem to me, again, thinking about American domestic politics, that a war in a country very far away with American soldiers dying probably would be quite unpopular.
There is, I mean, that's certainly a difficulty, without a doubt. I mean, in terms of American domestic politics, and certainly in the lead up to this, we did not see either most Republicans or Democrats. They were not really calling for military responses. I mean, that's something we noticed from both sides. That was not really on the table. Now things are in a very fluid situation. We'll have to see how things go. But that was, in the lead up to this, there was certainly a lot of reluctance to engage. Is it any more points on that, or we'll move on to another question? If this system of corruption does fold under Putin, do you think another dictator would emerge? Especially given Russia's Soros and totalitarian history, what would it take to establish an authentic democracy in Russia?
I'll give just a historical note. The last time they tried, glimmerings under Gorbachev, and then after the Soviet Union broke up under Yeltsin, it was pretty clear that the people involved, by and large, didn't have the democratic instincts required to make a democracy work. And that started with Yeltsin himself at the top, who rewrote the Constitution to give himself way more power, that presidential Constitution that Dr. Johnson referred to. So moves in that direction, the track record isn't good. I'll leave it to Dr. Street to talk about domestic comparative politics in that regard.
So yeah, this may be another area where I guess I probably disagree with Dr. Pavlakis, or potentially, and potentially with the way that this is discussed in the media. The fact that Russia had a czar, I just don't think that's really relevant. Most countries in the world were not democratic 100 years ago when Russia had a czar. Many countries now are. I think democracy has become in quite a short amount of time, a very popular concept globally. It aligns with nationalism, which is also a concept that in the way that we think about it now is fairly new. The idea that each nation would have its democratically governed state, those things kind of stick together. The world has been organized that way really only for 60 years now, since the end of empire. But it's become incredibly popular, and democracies do generally perform better on just about every metric. People are richer, they live longer, there's more freedom. So in general, and my experience living in different countries, is that a lot of people, regular people, would like and would benefit from democracy, but how do you get there? Because there's a coordination problem. How do people organize a massive protest that's going to be enough to overthrow a violent regime? My suggestion is always going to be that somebody else go first. And I probably would not be as brave as Alexei Navalny. And that logic is really clear, and it bites. So I think the problems with Russia democratizing are more to do with these kind of dynamics of a few people who have a lot of power and can do really bad things to the first set of protesters. And the only way you can overcome that is with a spontaneous massive protest. And every now and then that happens. When it happens very suddenly. But we basically can't predict when it will happen, I don't think.
What are going to be the economic ramifications in Ukraine because of the start of the war? It's going to be very negative, I think, and hurt the economy, hurt people's lives, and I mean, we'll have to see how things transpire. But there's nothing positive to say about it. I don't think. I think it will be calamitous.
Can I answer the question that wasn't asked, which is what's happening to the Russian economy as a result, even before the sanctions have really bitten? On the first day of the war, the Russian stock market fell 45%. It's almost by half. And the ruble lost about half its value on international markets, which has kicked off very rapid inflation that puts ours in the shadows, makes what we're seeing look like price stability. Will that continue? I can't predict. If you could predict, you could probably make lots of money.
Yeah, and to be clear, to be fair, this may be an area where the framework that I'm trying to use, this kind of idea that, well, how do we do science about humans? Difficult. Can we try and make a few assumptions about some kind of level of rationality? And then we've got a very simple scientific model, and we compare it to a bunch of data. I feel like that probably doesn't work that well in explaining the extent of this conflict. I think I mentioned this already. It seems that what Putin is taking on is really a big fight, at least initially, and potentially longer term, and that, as Dr. Johnson said, wars are just disastrous for the economy. Without stability, like, who's going to invest if your factory might get blown up? So again, I think Putin has been a powerful person who's held on to power for a long time, but that doesn't mean he's infallible. He may have miscalculated.
I have degrees in both political science and history, so I have the highest respect for methodologies from both disciplines, for what it's worth. So how does Western Europe's dependence on Russian oil affect the West's response?
I mean, it's less about oil than natural gas. That's a lot of the winter heating. Some people have said that the reason to do this in the winter is because this is when Europe is relying on Russian natural gas right now. I mean, I do think it's a problem. It does seem to me that the Western Europeans have been pretty timid in responding to Putin, and that the risk is that you encourage somebody. I mean, there were various ways in which this echoes what Hitler was doing in the 1930s. He was going up to neighboring countries and saying, oh, there's chunks of this population that are so persecuted and they want to come home to Germany, and then invading them. And if Putin is not Hitler, but I do think there's some risk that if there's no real response to these things, then Putin might just keep going. And that seems like a mistake to me, but they don't listen to me.
So I'll move on to the next question. Why has the situation been turned into a partisan issue? I've seen numerous articles blaming Trump for this, despite him not being in power anymore, which seems to be the thing about the modern United States. Everything becomes partisan. And it's true, Democrats do not like Trump and Republicans do not like Biden. And often things are often seen through that partisan lens. It's been exasperated and accentuated by cable news, social media, people who you talk to. And Russia and Ukraine, this has been going on for a number of years. Certainly, Democrats were furious with Russian interference in the 2016 election in terms of the social media, some of the stuff that was put on social media. And so, Democrats have a very dim view of Russia. You might recall that Trump's first impeachment involved a phone call to Zelensky in Ukraine to try to get him to do an investigation on Biden, involving some of those issues. That's part of what happened. So these issues have been in part and parcel, but so much is just seen through a partisan lens in the United States today. We're in a very sort of polarized climate. So almost any issue is going to be pulled into the partisan realm without fail. And certainly this is a major political issue that will define, I don't know if it'll define, but will at least partially define, how people view Biden and Biden's presidency. We have midterm elections coming in November. It's a big issue. Very unclear how this will affect the midterm elections. Republicans expect to gain seats, but in Congress, but we got to see. So that's my take on it. Anybody else?
From what I've seen, political scientists are generally skeptical about the relevance of foreign policy for domestic elections.
And that's usually true. Yeah.
Americans mostly don't care that much about this stuff. They'll talk about it. Sure, it's in the news now. I think it's right that we have become polarized in this way. I guess, some level of criticizing a government that's engaging in a war, that there may be some appropriate amount of that. And if it's channeled through one party or the other, I'm trying. I'm troubled by the partisan fighting in this country like anyone else, I think. But we do sometimes see in times of war, there's kind of a swing to like, well, then we have to support our leaders. And so some kind of counter pressure as well, maybe in a big picture, that's not so bad. It would limit recklessness, but I'm trying. That's the most optimistic I can be about that.
Okay. A student says, to my understanding, Russia is currently a part of the United Nations Security Council. Do you think that this status will soon change? And if so, how do you believe this will affect global relations with Russia? Anybody want to take the UN Security Council? Dr. Street? That sounds like.
I mean, I saw something yesterday in the way that I think Ukraine was talking in a UN meeting, some Ukrainian diplomat, and was saying, well, they were saying something along the lines that it was actually the USSR that was meant to be a standing member of the Security Council. And sure, is Russia really the same thing as the USSR? And I guess they were trying to hint that everyone should kick Russia off of the Security Council. I mean, Dr. Pavlakis can talk about this in more detail. The United Nations was set up after the Second World War, partly to try and avoid these patterns of escalation that we talked about Hitler doing and getting away with. And so it has a bunch of explicit stuff about not doing what Putin is doing now. But the UN has never been that strong of an organization and has weakened over time. I don't know whether they would kick, I suspect they wouldn't kick Russia off. It's tough because they have nuclear weapons. It's hard to mess with places that have nuclear weapons.
And procedurally, there's no way to do it because Russia and China would veto it. So it's such a move is pretty much doomed to fail without a rewriting of the UN Charter, as Dr. Street implied.
How do you think the lack of military response in Ukraine from NATO and the United States will impact the perceived costs for other revisionist countries? Should we expect there to be increasing tension over flashpoints like Taiwan, Kashmir, South Korea, et cetera?
I mean, Ukraine is not part of NATO, so in some ways it does make sense that there wouldn't be the same kind of NATO response. I do think there's a parallel to Taiwan, and that's presumably why, as Dr. Pavlakis just said, China is going to side with Russia on some of this stuff. It seems to me that in these kind of situations, where it's a much smaller country that doesn't have nuclear weapons getting invaded by a much bigger one that does, the question is really like, what's the occupation going to be like? If they're going to try and do an occupation, what's it going to be like? And I think the recent historical evidence suggests that occupying places by force is not popular, and you often do get nationalist resistance to that. And it seems to be that the Ukrainian government is hunkering down, and that's what they're looking for. it's a horrible situation. I mean, it's Afghanistan was in that for 20 years, right? Like this is the kind of horrible low-level fighting that messes everything up. But it also potentially, that might be the thing that's most likely to deter Russia or to deter China if they tried to occupy Taiwan.
So I just want to add, I'm going to put a couple questions together here. Putin is claiming that the Ukrainian government is carrying out a genocide against Russian speakers, and he's acting in self-defense. Is there any basis behind that statement? Also, Dr. Street mentioned that the Russian invasion seemed really big. Why didn't they work harder to destabilize Ukraine? It's just simply destabilize rather than invade.
The first question's easy to answer. As someone who's published in genocide studies, there is no indication, no clue of anything resembling the mildest civil disabilities, much less ethnic cleansing, much less genocide, perpetrated by the Ukrainian government against its Russian speakers. That is wholly for domestic consumption.
Second question, Dr. Street, can you answer that?
I'm sorry, could you restate it, please?
Sure. Why did Russia attack so harshly instead of trying to destabilize Ukraine? Without any ideas?
Again, I actually feel like this is probably the question that I can answer least well. And
Okay.
I think it's good to be upfront about that. Like in general, I do find this framework useful for thinking about. Again, I've been doing it myself. I'm talking about Russia and China. What I mean is the corrupt, terrible people, small number of, who are in charge of the military of those places. I guess, I mean, the best I can do, I think, is that Putin is, maybe has had this kind of rational actor dynamics going on. I think his behavior in the past is largely consistent with that. But he is getting older. And so there's less stability. He has less certainty, has a less long timeline to think about enjoying the fruits of his corruption. He may be more interested in grandiose ideas about his legacy. And I guess the other thing is that structurally, when you have a situation where so much power is concentrated in one person, that one person can do terrible nuts stuff without much constraint. Perhaps even more than a lot of his oligarch supporters would actually like. Like a lot of them might actually have preferred the smaller scale version. But when you have one person with so little constraint, then terrible things can happen.
Are we escalating into a slippery slope situation that brings into the nuclear question?
I've already given my take on that, which is that everybody seems to be doing what they can to avoid that, but be interested in hearing any.
Nothing else? Okay. Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure. So Putin is claiming that the Ukrainian government is carrying out we answered that, sorry. Will Poland welcome Ukrainian citizens? How will that work out?
I mean, I think this is a good question. Potentially there will be quite a lot of refugees. The Polish government has some slightly weird, non-democratic behavior in its own recent past, but nothing on the scale of Putin. And I think the current Polish government has been doing some stuff where they like arbitrarily changed all the Supreme Court justices and stuff like that. But in general, the sense that I get from the Polish elite politician people, and maybe in the wider population there, is that they don't remember the Soviet occupation happily. And so they're not going to be too happy about this. Poland and Hungary and some of those other countries have generally been pretty anti-Syrian refugee, whereas the Western European countries have been much more favorable, especially Germany. So it seems possible. It seems like it may be more likely Germany than Poland in the end, and probably that some of the Ukrainians would rather end up in Germany than Poland if they could. But it's a big country, and bigger and much closer than Syria, and this, huge numbers of refugees would be would cause all sorts of potentially cause consequences in Europe. I mean, I guess the one thing I would say is that sometimes I feel like we underestimate, like if countries decide that they're going to take refugees, they actually can historically. After the Second World War, in the immediate aftermath, something like a third of the population of Germany was the German-speaking people who had been forced out by the Red Army, been forced out of Ukraine, Poland, and all sorts of other parts, because they'd been kind of spread out all over the place. And there seemed to be a somewhat, there was bits of resentment, but there was some recognition that this was how it was going to be in Germany. And in the end, that period of the late 40s and early 50s into the 60s even is now, in retrospect, regarded as a period of remarkable economic rebuilding by the Germans, and they're quite proud of that. So sometimes countries really can accommodate a lot of refugees, but that could be pretty complicated.
One of our guests says she read an article which opined that Ukraine had been betrayed by the West, which encouraged them to disarm, abandon their nuclear capacity. The article suggested that this current situation will be a cautionary tale to make other potential nuclear states. And if we don't move in forcefully, we will encourage states to believe they must fend for themselves and can't rely on us as allies. Is this a significant threat to us?
So Dr. Pavlakis maybe will, I'm afraid I don't remember too much of that. I think there was some, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was some nuclear weapons kind of left over in what became Ukrainian territory. I'm afraid I don't remember the details of that. I think the second part of that though is broadly correct, but I think that was broadly correct already. Like it's been very clear from the US behavior over recent years that they don't mess with nuclear states and they do mess with non-nuclear states. Libya, the Libyan leader, I think actually did give up his nuclear weapons at one point, and I'm sure he regretted it when he died.
There was a treaty. It was considered one of the triumphs of the post-Soviet transition because Russia signed it, Ukraine signed it, and the United States signed it, guaranteeing Ukraine's borders and border security in exchange for Ukraine turning over all its nuclear weapons to Russia. Clearly that guarantee is inoperative. And Dr. Street brings up Libya. I think that question has been asked ever since 2011 when Libya was invaded by Western troops and the government collapsed. So the question is already out there, and the Ukraine example, I think, just reinforces the lesson in a different context.
So someone's asking about so if Ukraine's overtaken by Russia, will Russia claim it as part of the main nation or give an illusion of a sovereign state instead of a Putin-backed leader?
Well, what Putin has said, if you can believe an inveterate liar, is that he's just going to clean out the current government and then withdraw, which suggests a puppet state, right? He wants a friendly government, but I don't know if I believe that or disbelieve it.
We've had a number of questions about China. So let's just, anything else you want to say about China in relation to this crisis? Alex, anything else?
I mean, I guess in the spirit of continuing this idea that we can learn the things from thinking about the domestic politics of these places. Again, when we talk about China, and I've done it myself, I'm afraid, that is a shorthand for 1.4 billion people who disagree with each other about just about everything, probably a lot of the time. Some of whom have way more power than others. In the Chinese case, the Chinese leadership is, I think there's also some evidence of corruption, but it's not quite the kind of like mafia state that Russia is. And it's much more bureaucratic, which when Americans use that word, it's I think almost always an insult. But I think bureaucratic often can be good relative to the alternatives. So a bureaucratic system of the Chinese Communist Party is very hierarchical and very complicated, and it's generally hard to get to the top, and those people seem to be competent and more stable. So it seems possible to me that the overall behavior of a leadership set up that way would be a bit more predictable than the kind of thing that you would get from Putin. But there are also some similarities, I think.
What will happen with protests in Russia? We've talked a little bit about this, seeing some brave folks protesting. Anything else you want to talk about the protests in Russia?
I guess, again, like, we don't know. They won't work until maybe suddenly they do. And I don't think anyone knows. You know, sometimes people say that one thing. So here's one way of thinking about it is, why does Putin even bother having elections? Like, he often poisons people, prevents them from getting media coverage, bans parties, all sorts of stuff. So why does he even bother having elections? I think it is partly about this norm of democracy that I mentioned a bit earlier, that I think this has become one of probably the prevailing view of how life should be, that people should live in democratic nation states. But the other thing is, some scholars think that leaders like him, sometimes it makes sense for them to hold elections as a way of telling, like, okay, how unpopular am I right now? And that they may actually want to adjust their behavior a bit based on that. Or they'll hold regional elections, and then if there's one particular region where the guy is just being even more annoying and corrupt than the rest, then they can get sign of that from, oh, this guy is really, really unpopular, so maybe we better get rid of him to kind of avoid our system becoming too unstable. So, but in general, because he doesn't have real elections, and because there's so many restrictions on freedom of speech and so many dangers of people protesting, Putin doesn't know exactly how unpopular he is, and nobody knows. But that again, that probably makes the situation less stable for him.
How effective will sanctions be? Sanctions from the West being imposed on Russia. We had a couple of questions about sanctions.
I mean, Dean, do you have historical examples of sanctions working?
They often don't. I'm sorry, Dean.
No, in fact, it's kind of curious, because this situation may tend itself more towards a slightly greater likelihood of working. As Dr. Street said, Putin is pretty insulated, but his oligarchs are not. They've thrown their money all over the West. They own houses in London, they own apartments in New York. And the one case where international disapproval and sanctions had an impact was on the South African apartheid government. So that's probably the best historical example we had. That took a long time, many, many years before the middle class and elite got really tired of being pariahs. And that was a big contributor to change. But I'm not aware of any other case where sanctions have done much good.
Elena.
Can I just say one more thing? Sorry.
Of course.
I would just add, I mean, I was also thinking of South Africa as a case where maybe there was a little bit of influence. But again, in that case, I just think, 99% plus of the credit has to actually just go to Nelson Mandela and people like that who, did the real nonviolent, mass, dangerous, risky, scary protest. And so, I don't know, maybe 99%, maybe Dean would not quite go that high, but it seems to me that these leaders are insulated. It's hard to get cracks going on within the structure that's holding them up, because they have a lot of violent power at their disposal. And then kind of hurting the wider population does not necessarily make these leaders, the leaders are already unpopular for better reasons than because someone else imposed sanctions.
Thank you, Elena. So youth views leading towards the West and Western culture in general. I just want you to start off with that. In a person's experience, most of the young people in Western Ukraine identify much more with Western democracies. Do you have anything to say about that? And then Dr. Pavlakis and Dr. Street.
Yeah, I would say that's pretty accurate. Admittedly, I suppose there is a little bit of a selection bias in the fact that those who came to Estonia to study abroad with me, admittedly, I was the only American there. So their willingness to associate with me and that sort of thing might have affected a little bit who I ended up having these sorts of discussions with. But in general, the sense that I got is that there is that sort of leaning towards a Western democracy. And I think it really comes from a center in interest in Western culture and the depth of Western culture. And this isn't even just American culture, though that is one of the things I was a little bit disappointed by when I went there, is just the prevalence of so many American things out and about. But there is also this sort of European wave and this sort of European way of doing things that's becoming more popular and is seen as the forward thinking. As I sort of mentioned, in Estonia, they want to shed their sort of Soviet Slavic identity and head towards a more Nordic identity, which is seen as like the sort of future. So I would say that they're still pretty prevalent and pretty strong, and that could have ramifications generationally later on.
Any additional answers, Dr. Street or Dr. Pavlakis?
I love your use of the term selection bias. Thank you, Elena.
So here's an interesting question. Oh, Dr. Pavlakis, do you have anything to say?
Yeah, I think the interest in the West is complicated, and I would point to interviews that I've heard reported on NPR over the last month or so of people just outside the separatist areas of Donetsk and Luhansk. People who in 2014 were in many cases hoping they would get included in that separatist enclave. And they've had now 8 years to watch what's going on in Russia, what's going on in Ukraine, and to really what's becoming a kind of a puppet gangster state in Donetsk and Luhansk. And the interviews, and again, who knows how these people are chosen and how they volunteered to be interviewed. But the interviews over and over again were, no, we are Russian speakers, but we are not interested in separatism, and we do not want to be part of Vladimir Putin's Russia. And so it's, if only a negative vote of confidence in the direction that Ukraine had been moving.
Here's a very interesting and different question about communication, interpersonal communication. Do we have any advice for how to discuss the situation with peers who we know who are Ukrainian or have family there? I'm finding it difficult to offer support or empathy because everything I start to say feels too small or not quite right. I will say, I think it can be difficult, but I think showing your concern and compassion is a good way to start, and many people will respond to that. Other thoughts about how to talk to someone who's Ukrainian?
What I did personally today, because I have a friend who's out of town who's Ukrainian and who posted on social media about how worried he is for his family, has conveyed a message of concern and sympathy, and what a hard time it must be for him.
Good. In his address to the Russian people, Putin said, "We hear more often lately from the West that documents signed by the Soviet regime that fixed results of the Second World War should not be implemented." What do you think he's referring to?
I have no idea.
All right.
The treaties that collectively finally settled the borders are the Helsinki Accords, but I'm not aware that they contained anything that's being repudiated right now.
So we have so many great questions, but we're gonna have to wrap this up soon. So we're just gonna have to take a few of these. If there's any questions that the panelists would like to respond to that you see here, feel free to read it out and answer. What does the panel think about arguments about Ukrainian attack as predictable as part of the 1930s, like March of Aggression, a wider gathering storm of Ukraine as a Russian Sudetenland? Does anyone want to take that one? Connecting it back to events from the 1930s?
I don't see the parallel. I mean, Hitler's ambitions were boundless, and we don't have any evidence that Putin's ambitions are boundless. Although the invasion of Poland from 3 sides sure looks like the invasion of Ukraine from 3 sides.
So someone asked the question, did Putin increase his popularity through use of the military against Chechnya? Does he think does he want to do this again? war helping his popularity?
So I think it's a bit complicated. I think there were two Chechen wars, and Russia didn't do so well in the first, as I recall, and that was pretty unpopular. And then Putin was more directly involved in the second and was much, much more brutal, and put in a kind of drug lord, kind of local person family to do the local ruling for them. And so within Russia, he may have gotten some kind of a credibility, I guess, boost from that stuff. Again, I don't really think that Putin is doing this because he thinks that there's going to be some glorious swelling of patriotism in the Russian people to finally see their soldiers marching again or something like that. It doesn't seem to me that the public opinion effects from this kind of conflict are that big. It seems much more likely, much more credible to me that this is about messing up what would otherwise be a positive example of how nice things could be in Russia if they could just get rid of Putin.
With a question about SWIFT, Dr. Pavlakis, do you want to take that? You're muted.
I have a background in banking, and for those of you who don't know, SWIFT is the worldwide network for transmitting money between banks. And one of the things people have talked about is booting Russia from SWIFT. There is a tremendous risk to the world system as it is from doing that, and it's not out of Russia. The risk is that China, with its immense technological capabilities, builds a competitor to SWIFT. And that is why, I don't know if you heard, Janet Yellen has testified or given an interview, I'm not sure which, against using SWIFT as a tool of sanctions at this time. People are very worried at what happens to the world financial system if money movement splits between SWIFT and a perhaps less controlled, more authoritarian, less worried about laundering money financial system.
At what point do we stop importing oil and gas from Russia? Not going to happen?
We don't import Russian gas.
Do they mean European? I think, yeah. Go ahead. Anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the US is, I don't think is really importing much of either. It's a little bit complicated because the US actually exports oil and gas, but there's, they come in all these different grades depending on the number of octanes or something like that, which depends on exactly the different sources. So for some uses, you might use a bit of this or whatever, but I don't think the US is doing much of that. I think the Europe has relied much more heavily. And it's complex. I mean, it's a mess because it takes a long time to transition that kind of thing to say, okay, we're going to build a lot more wind farms. Or Germany actually a few years ago switched away from nuclear power because in response to the Fukushima tidal wave thing in Japan, where a tidal wave kind of smashed into a nuclear reactor there and caused some spreading poison around there. And so the German chancellor at the time made this kind of sudden switch away from nuclear power. So they don't have that many options. And again, in retrospect, it seems to me obvious that they should have been planning some kind of change for years. Unfortunately, I mean, Germany has a history of, during the Cold War, they did kind of want not to be, I mean, again, the German government prevailing across different parties to some extent was they didn't really want to be taking a side because they'd already been ripped apart. And so they tried to be a bit careful about that, and they were maybe a little bit more pro-Russian than some of the other governments around them. But there are still pro-Russian German politicians. One of the former chancellors there, a guy called Gerhard Schröder, who was chancellor in the late 90s and early 2000s, basically sold his soul to the devil and became a board member of Gazprom, which is one of these big companies that sells natural gas to Europe, and used his remaining political influence to try and help, corrupt oligarchs in Russia. And so unfortunately, they haven't made that switch, and maybe they'll do it now, but it's going to take a long time. It's not the kind of thing you can do overnight.
What would Putin consider a win? What would Putin consider a win? That's a very good question. He's been kind of boxed into, yeah, so what would a win be?
I mean, in one version, staying in power until he dies. Because, you can't retire happily if you're the kind of person who's done the kind of things that he's done. If you try and retire happily, that means that somebody else is in charge now. And Putin and his allies at this point own such a big part of the Russian economy that person is inevitably going to want to come after some of that. They may even just need to run the economy and to prop up whatever system they have. Or they may want, if it's a more democratic system, they might want to for reasons of justice and some kind of recompense. So one of the things that makes these political systems unstable, and you saw this there's some recent examples people may be familiar with. Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe was in his early 90s and then suddenly was overthrown, and things have been a bit less stable since then. Hosni Mubarak in Egypt was also late 80s, I think, and was getting unstable, and so then suddenly he gets overthrown. That you get more and more of this kind of like, oh, who's going to be the next one? And that the older the person gets, the less stable it gets. So
I think he'd also, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I mean, a good outcome for him is that he gets to die suddenly in his sleep at the age of 99, and nobody has challenged his power yet, and he hasn't been thrown in jail yet. But unfortunately, I think the ending will probably be less stable than that.
Possibly do you think a pledge from NATO that Ukraine won't be a member? That'd be a win for him, don't you think so? Dr. Pavlakis?
Well, from the security perspective, I mean, I think I've said that. Yeah, I think that pledge would be a win. And I also think it's a pledge that will never be made. I mean, we're not even good at honoring treaties 20, 30 years out. How are we going to be good at a pledge for forever?
Okay. So we have a lot of other good questions here. I apologize that we can't get to all of them, but we have to close this up. I'm going to give the panelists, if they want to answer any final questions. I will say that as we've been talking, Chernobyl has been taken and the staff has been taken prisoner. That's just come in the news lines from CNN. So the crisis continues to move. Any final comments from, so Elena, do you have any final comments that you'd like to bring in?
Well, off the top of my head, I did see a few questions about Estonia's sort of reaction to this. And if I might add it as just a tiny footnote, there has been some questions. I've seen some interviews with the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister has really emphasized that they are sifting up their borders and they are ready to act with NATO if need be. And as far as anything other, if I might as well, I did my senior paper on China. And so I think that there are different sort of relationships that the US has with Taiwan than the ones that it has with Ukraine, such as there is a specific agreement that the US has with Taiwan in which they will intervene if China shows the willingness to take over. So, which I don't believe there is anything of that nature with Ukraine. So those are just some of my closing remarks. Thank you.
Dr. Street. Dr. Pavlakis.
I'd just like to say we need to keep the people of Ukraine in mind, and the people who live under the government of Russia. Putin's game, whatever he's playing it for, and I do think a lot of it is for domestic reasons rather than geopolitical ones, but we just should keep those people in our thoughts and not forget about them, because in this crazy news cycle, something else is going to come up and it will be easy to do that. It will be easy to overlook.
It will be interesting to see whether, another question was, will this matter to our day-to-day lives? Well, for many of us, maybe not yet, but I mean, we'll have to sort of see how things go here. It's very hard to make those sort of predictions. I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank Matt Larson, who has helped with the Zoom technology, and Dr. Pavlakis, who also worked with the Zoom technology to run this webinar. I'd like to thank our panelists, especially big thanks to Elena, who agreed to do this with us this evening. And so I really appreciate her insights as well. Thank you, everybody, for being such great guests. Again, my apologies apologies we couldn't get to every single question. It was a great group who came. Have a wonderful evening, everyone, and take care.